Greetings and welcome to this week's edition of Nuggets of Hope, Mighty Works of God series. My name is Deacon Sidney Ali, and I will be speaking on the biblical account of when the sun stood still, found in the book of Joshua, chapter 10. Now, before I begin, I'd like to ask, have you ever found yourself rushing to get somewhere and ask God to make time stop? I know I have, and sometimes it seemed like time did stop, or maybe I just stepped on the gas a little harder. There was a time years ago when I flew east and the plane went from sunlight to sunlight. Was that a miracle? No. That was just a natural occurrence having something to do with flying close to the equator. However, the account in the book of Joshua was by no means a natural occurrence. God did, in fact, make time stop, and He did it in the most miraculous way. In Joshua 10, we see Israel engaged in battle. And this was typical for Israel. However, this time, Israel was defending another group of people, and they were not up against one army, but up against 5 enemy armies. How did they get in this position? The Bible tells us that Israel had been commanded by God through Moses to take possession of their surrounding land and to annihilate its inhabitants. Why? Because God knew that these people would forever fight against the purposes of God, and they were idol worshippers. Okay, now there was one group of people, the Gibeonites, in the surrounding land, okay, who recognized that Israel's God fought for them. They heard how God had rescued them from the hand of Pharaoh in Egypt, and they also knew that God had recently allowed them to conquer the lands of Ai and Jericho. And they also knew that God had commanded them through Moses to take possession of their surrounding land and annihilate the inhabitants, which included them. So, to save themselves, the Gibeonites devised a plan to get Israel to make a peace treaty with them. And they did this by tricking Israel into thinking that they were from a land far away when in fact they were neighbors. And the Bible tells us that Israel fell for their deception because they neglected to seek God about the decision. So Joshua established a peace treaty with them to let them live. Now, when Israel's surrounding enemy neighbors, 5 kings in particular, heard that the Gibeonites had joined forces with Israel, they were not happy. So they formed an alliance because now they were upset. They lost their allies, the Gibeonites, who were fierce, strong warriors, and their city was a strong one, a large one. Okay, so they devised a plan and they formed this alliance to attack the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites then sent word to Joshua asking for help, and Israel had to help because of this peace treaty. So Joshua now seeks the Lord, and we see in verse 8, chapter 10, God responds and says, "Do not be afraid of them, for I have handed them over to you. Not one of them will be able to stand against you." So Joshua and his men, they march up to Gilgal, and a battle takes place. And this is something like a David and Goliath type scenario, with Israel being the underdog. Imagine 5 armies against one. And here is where we see the mighty works of God. There were actually 3 that day. The first one we see in verse 10, where God threw the enemy armies into confusion. Okay, they might have been like you and Amorite or Israelite. I forgot which I'm supposed to fight. Okay, the second mighty work of God. Okay, we see Israel, all right, advancing and the enemy armies fleeing. And the Bible tells us that the Lord threw large hailstones from the sky. This makes for a good cartoon. Can you imagine that? Big balls of ice falling on the enemy, like a bowling ball, knocking out pins. Up, 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 up. Okay? Um, and these hailstones, all right, the Bible says that it killed more of them than by the sword. One of our leaders, Pastor Rosa Powell Brown, recently preached a sermon about the strategic, timely, non-coincidental working of God in a message she titled, "It Just So Happened." And that's what we see here. It just so happened at the opportune time, God sent a hailstorm, okay, which knocked out many of Israel's enemies. Notice there was no mention of any Israelite being hit by one of these hailstones. Why? Because our God has perfect aim and he does not miss his target. Now, the third and grand finale of mighty works that day was that the sun stood still. And let's read about that in chapter 10, verses 12 to 14. And the Holmes Christian Standard Version reads, on the day the Lord gave the Amorites over to the Israelites, Joshua spoke to the Lord in the presence of Israel. Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and moon over the valley of Ajalon. And the sun stood still, and the moon stopped until the nation took vengeance on its enemies. So the sun stopped in the middle of the sky and delayed its setting almost a full day. There has been no day like it before or since when the Lord listened to the voice of a man, because the Lord fought for Israel. So here we see God used the greatest star in our galaxy to work on behalf of his people. Why did God do this? Well, two things come to mind. First, Joshua asked in faith, believing that God could in fact do it. The Bible tells us, is there anything too hard for God? Second, Joshua's request was in accordance to God's will. It was God's will that Israel take the surrounding land and destroy its inhabitants, as commanded through Moses. And the Bible says in John 5, verse 15, now this is the confidence we have before him. Whenever we ask anything according to his will, he hears us. Joshua's request was, in fact, in accordance with God's will. It was not for selfish gain. He did not say, oh God, give me more time so I can watch the season finale of The Voice, or today is Prime Day on Amazon. I want to see what deals are cooking. Give me more time. No. His request was in accordance with God's will. The sun did not set that day, giving Israel the needed daylight to continue wiping out the enemy. And this was a mighty battle, and God worked in a mighty way. Now, what does that say to you and me today? Okay? If you are a blood-washed, born-again believer in Jesus Christ, okay, God will fight for you. God is the same. The Bible tells us God is the same God yesterday, today, and forever. And he takes pleasure in showing up for his children, defeating the enemies of our body, soul, and spirit. Our God will fight for us. He will confuse minds, change minds, harden hearts, soften hearts, and even stop hearts. He will align events to take place at the perfect time, his Kairos time. And he is sovereign over all his creation, and he will use anything and everything under the sun, including the sun, to accomplish his purposes for his children. Aren't you glad? Aren't you glad you serve a mighty God? God bless.
Thank you for joining us in this week's Nuggets of Hope. We hope you continue to join us, and we hope that you are blessed by each teaching. You can join us on Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube. God bless you.